whistling came from the grass itself, thin as a reed, yet steady as a man's breath, and it moved without haste around our camp, as if it knew the paths between the hammocks. The night had turned strangely cool. My skin tightened under my shirt as though a cloud had passed over the moon. When the tune climbed to a higher note, our mule sank to its knees and would not rise. Men have asked me in later years to set down what occurred upon the Llanos, and I have delayed, for the telling brings back the very taste of that air. If you have heard such whistling in lonely country, speak of it. If my account holds you, give it your approval, attach your name to my future recollections, and leave your remark beneath this narration. It began 3 weeks earlier, on the 6th of May 1891, when we left the river port at San Fernando de Apure with the first light and a ledger of measurements to fill. I had been engaged by the Commission de Limites, a mixed party of surveyors and naturalists tasked with verifying landmarks and watercourses between the Apure and the Meta, a work of paper and compass made urgent by politics, cattle, and pride. Our instruments were plain: a prismatic compass, a brass sextant in its case, a chain for distance, field glasses, and a barometer wrapped in oilcloth. We carried 2 carbines, 1 old shotgun, and more confidence than was proper in country that could swallow men without leaving a bone. There were 4 of us who counted as the expedition proper. I was the recorder, educated in Caracas, with a habit of noting the hour and the direction of every wind. Don Rafael Urdaneta, our chief, had served with engineers and spoke of the plains as if they were a problem to be solved by patience. Tomas Becerra, a llanero hired for his horsemanship, knew the grasses the way a sailor knows swells. And Henderson, Mr. William Henderson, was an English naturalist attached to us by correspondence, keen on birds and insects, with a quiet manner and a small notebook always in his pocket. We also had a guide from the region, a man called Eusebio, who had agreed to take us as far as the caños that fed the Arauca. He was older than Tomas, with a face that had been burned and dried by seasons, and he carried, besides his machete, a rosary wound twice around his wrist. The first days were what I had expected: heat that pressed like a hand upon the skull, a horizon so wide it made one feel both free and diminished, and the constant labor of keeping paper dry. The Llanos in May were not yet flooded, but the earth held water in pockets, and the air smelled of wet clay and cattle. At dusk, the mosquitoes rose in clouds, and we smeared ourselves with grease and ash, cursing softly while Don Rafael checked bearings by the last light. On the 3rd evening, we made camp near a stand of moriche palms, their trunks straight as poles, and their crowns black against a sky the color of embers. Tomas strung the hammocks between 2 trunks, and Henderson produced a tin of tobacco he claimed had come from Trinidad. We sat on our heels, passing the rolled leaf, and for a little while the expedition was only men and smoke, and the familiar talk that keeps the dark from pressing too close. Henderson spoke of his sister in Devon, of hedgerows and rain that fell without violence. Tomas answered with a grin, saying he would not trade the open plain for any English fence. Don Rafael, who rarely spoke of himself, surprised me by mentioning a child he had not seen in 2 years, left with family in Valencia while he chased lines on maps. "You measure the world," Henderson said to him, "and the world measures what you miss." Don Rafael looked into the coals. "When the work is done," he said, I will return. That is the bargain. I remember that moment because it was the last time we spoke easily of return, as if it were a road that always waited. The first anomaly was so slight that I did not write it down as such. In the early hours before dawn, when the air was usually full of frogs and distant birds, there came a stretch of silence so complete that I woke with the sense of having been called by my name. The palms did not move. The insects ceased their thin ringing. Even the mules stopped shifting their weight. Then, as if a hand had been lifted, the sounds returned at once, and I told myself it had been a passing change of wind. Eusebio crossed himself when I mentioned the silence. "It is nothing," I said, with the impatience of a man trained to trust causes. "Animals rest." He did not argue. He only tightened the rosary around his wrist until the beads pressed into his skin. We moved southeast, taking bearings from the sun when the sky allowed, and from a lone tsiba that rose like a monument in the grass. The days were hard, but ordinary. We waded shallow streams, measured their widths, noted the quality of the banks. Henderson collected beetles in a small box and once stopped to watch a heron stalk fish with such concentration that Thomas laughed and called him a priest of birds. On the 9th day, we found tracks near a muddy edge of a caño. At first, I took them for those of a man, for they had the length of a foot and the deep press of weight. But the toes were wrong, too long and splayed as if the creature had stepped with a kind of grasp. Thomas crouched, touched the impression, and sniffed his fingers. "Tapir?" I offered. Thomas shook his head. "Tapir does not walk like this, and it does not come alone." There were no other marks, no drag of tail, no sign of hoof. The grass around the mud stood upright, undisturbed. It was as if something had placed its foot there to show itself and then lifted away into air. Henderson made a sketch and wrote a note. "Perhaps a deformity," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "An injured man." Don Rafael straightened. No man would walk barefoot here without leaving blood. We left the tracks behind, and I told myself that mud plays tricks, that edges collapse, that the mind makes patterns from broken lines. Yet that night, I dreamed of feet that did not belong to any animal I had studied. On the 12th day, the weather turned. A bank of cloud came up from the east and sat over the plain like a lid. The heat did not lessen, but the light changed, becoming flat without shadow. We marched under it with sweat running down our backs and our shirts clinging like wet paper. The mules grew restless, tossing their heads, and Henderson remarked that even the birds flew low, as if reluctant to rise into that dull ceiling. Near midday, Eusebio stopped. He had been walking ahead, machete in hand, and now he stood still, head angled as if listening. "What is it?" Don Rafael asked. Eusebio did not answer at once. His eyes moved over the grass, over the distant palms, over the empty horizon. "Silbido," he said finally. "A whistle." I heard nothing but the wind moving through the blades. Thomas listened, frowning, then spat. "Old man hears ghosts," he muttered. Eusebio looked at him with a calm that was not meek. "In these plains," he said, "the whistle is never only wind." I confess I smiled then, not unkindly, but with the certainty of my education. Folklore was for firesides. We were men of measurement. Still, when I put my ear toward the open air, I thought I detected a faint, steady tone, too regular to be insect, too clean to be bird. It came and went like a thread caught and released. We made camp early, for the clouds threatened rain. Don Raphael had us set the tents low and secure the instrument cases. Henderson laid his specimens in order and then, without being asked, helped Tomas check the mule hobbles twice. That small act stayed with me. It was not fear, not yet, but it was attention sharpened. That night, the rain did not fall. The clouds held their water and drifted away, leaving the stars hard and bright. We ate dried beef and cassava, and Tomas sang a verse of a joropo under his breath, more for himself than for us. Eusebio did not eat much. He sat apart, rosary in hand, moving his lips. "Tell us," Henderson said at last, gently, "about the whistle you spoke of." Eusebio hesitated, as if weighing whether knowledge was a burden to be shared. "El Silbón," he said. "The whistler. He walks with a sack of bones. He calls with a tune that climbs and falls. If you hear it near, he is far. If you hear it far, he is near." Tomas laughed once sharply. "And if we do not hear it at all?" Eusebio's gaze stayed on the darkness beyond the fire. "Then he is watching." Don Rafael made a sound of dismissal. "We are not children." "No," Eusebio agreed. "Children are spared sometimes." I wrote none of this in my official journal. I wrote only, "Guide reports local superstition, morale unaffected." I see now that I was already arranging the world into acceptable shapes. Over the next days, the evidence did not come as a single blow. It came as small, persistent alterations, like a fever that rises by fractions. The mules began to balk at certain stretches of grass, as if scenting something. Once, when we approached a shallow depression, every frog in it ceased at once, and the silence spread outward in a ring. Henderson remarked on it quietly, and I saw him glance at Eusebio, who was already making the sign of the cross. On the 15th day, we found a tree marked in a way I could not account for. It was a lone algarobo, its bark pale, standing near a dry channel. Along its trunk, at the height of a man's chest, were scratches deep enough to show raw wood, arranged in a spiral as if something had circled it with a claw. Tomas ran his thumb along one groove and drew it back quickly. "Jaguar," he said, though he did not sound certain. "A jaguar would leave hair," Henderson replied, bending to look. "And the marks would be paired. These are deliberate." Deliberate. That word lodged in me. Nature leaves signs without intention. Deliberate suggested a mind. That evening, we spoke less. Don Raphael checked our route twice, as if the compass might have shifted. Henderson cleaned his field glasses with care that bordered on ritual. Tomas sharpened his machete until the sound of stone on steel set my teeth on edge. Eusebio refused to sleep in the hammock and instead lay on the ground near the fire, as if he wished to feel the earth. On the 17th day, we reached a region where the grass grew higher than a man's waist, and the ground under it was soft, threaded with water. Progress slowed. We used poles to test each step. Our boots sank and pulled free with a sucking sound. The air smelled of stagnant pools and sweet rot. It was in that place that we first heard the whistling clearly. It came at midday, when the sun was directly above, and there should have been only heat and the distant call of birds. The tune was simple, a sequence of notes that rose and fell with maddening patience. It did not waver as a man's whistle does when breath falters. It held steady, as if the air itself was shaped into sound. Tomas stopped walking. His face lost color. Don Raphael lifted his hand for silence, and we stood in the grass with sweat running into our eyes, listening. "It is a man," I said, though my mouth was dry. "A herder, Someone calling cattle. Henderson shook his head slowly. No cattle answer, and it is too clean. Eusebio whispered, "Do not answer. Do not call back." Tomas made a strangled sound, half laugh, half protest. "We are lost to a tune now." The whistling ceased. The sudden absence of it was worse. In the silence that followed, I heard the small sounds of our bodies. Henderson's swallow, the creak of leather, the faint click of Don Rafael's compass lid. Then, from behind us, the whistling began again, the same tune, the same steady breath. We turned as one. There was only grass bending in the wind. Don Rafael's jaw tightened. "We will proceed." We did, but our line tightened, our spacing closing, as if we were soldiers in brush. I tried to keep my mind on bearings and distances, on the work that had brought us there. Yet I found myself counting the notes of the whistle, as if number could make it harmless. That night, Henderson spoke low to me while the others slept. "In England," he said, "there are tales of spirits that announce themselves by sound. I do not credit them, yet I have heard men whistle. This was not that." "Sound carries strangely over flat land," I said. "It may come from miles away." He looked at me with tired eyes. Then why did it seem to circle us? I had no answer that satisfied even myself. On the 19th day, we lost a mule. It was not taken by teeth or claw. We had tethered it with the others, checked the knots, and slept. At dawn, the rope lay in the grass, neatly coiled as if placed by a careful hand. The mule was gone. There were no tracks leading away, no torn earth, no broken grass. The rest of the animals stood close together, heads low, trembling. Tomas swore and searched in widening circles. Don Rafael examined the rope, his fingers moving over the fibers. "No cut," he said. "No fray." Henderson pointed to the ground near the coiled rope. In the damp soil was a single footprint, the same wrong splayed toes we had seen days before. It was pressed deep, as if the creature had stood there and waited. My skepticism strained then, like a rope pulled too hard. Theft by man was possible, but why leave no trail? Predation by animal did not fit the neatness. I told myself it was a trick of the wet ground, that we had missed the signs in low light. Yet the coiled rope sat in my mind like an insult. Eusebio refused to go farther after that. He stood with his pack on his shoulders, eyes fixed on the east where the grass met sky. "I have done what I promised," he said to Don Rafael. "Beyond this, the plains have their own will." Don Rafael's voice hardened. "We pay you to guide, not to tremble." Eusebio did not tremble. That was what unsettled me. His calm had the weight of resignation. "I have children," he said simply. "They need a father more than you need a line on paper." He left us then, walking back the way we had come, alone, his machete swinging at his side. Tomas watched him go with contempt that did not last. When the old man's figure dwindled into the grass, Tomas's shoulders sagged as if something essential had been removed. We pressed on with 3 mules and 4 men. The horizon grew emptier. The sky widened. At times, the grass seemed to ripple in patterns that did not match the wind, as if something moved beneath it. Henderson began to speak less of insects and more of sound. He would pause, head cocked, as if trying to decide whether the whistling was real or memory. At approximately the 21st day, near a shallow lagoon edged with reeds, we experienced the moment that broke our routine and set dread into our bones with a sudden hand. We had stopped to boil water and Henderson had set his notebook on a crate beside the instrument case. Tomas walked to the water's edge to fill the pot. Don Rafael knelt over the compass, muttering calculations. I heard a faint ticking, like a watch dropped in grass. It came from the sextant case. "Henderson," I said, "did you leave something inside?" He looked up, puzzled. "No." The ticking quickened. Then the brass latch of the case lifted by itself, slowly, as if pushed from within. The lid rose a finger's breadth. Cold air spilled out, unmistakable, a breath that smelled of damp earth and something old, like a closed church. Don Rafael froze. Tomas backed away, pot forgotten. Henderson stepped forward despite himself, his hand hovering. The lid snapped open. Inside, the sextant lay as we had packed it, but across the velvet lining were scattered small white fragments, clean and curved. For a moment, my mind refused to name them. Then I understood they were pieces of bone, polished as if by handling, arranged in a neat line that mimicked the arc of the sextant itself. Henderson made a sound in his throat and reached for one fragment. Don Rafael caught his wrist. "Do not," Don Rafael said. The whistling began at once, very soft, as if in approval, and not from any direction we could point to. It seemed to come from the air above the open case. We shut the lid, strapped it tight, and moved camp without speaking. That day's march was hurried and clumsy. We stumbled in the wet ground, cursed, righted loads that slipped. The rational explanations I had relied upon were now thin paper in rain. No man could have opened a latched case without our seeing. No animal could have placed bone fragments in so careful a line. That night, Tomas drank more aguardiente than was wise, his hands shaking as he poured. Henderson sat apart, staring at the closed sextant case as if it were a coffin. Don Rafael wrote in his journal with furious strokes, then tore out the page and fed it to the fire. "What did you write?" I asked, startled. "What cannot be filed," he said, his voice low. "What will make us sound mad?" I watched the paper curl and blacken. I understood then that our danger was not only in the grass, but in the distance between what we would live and what we could later admit. Over the next days, the whistling became a measure of our hours. Sometimes it came at dawn, threading through the mist that rose from low ground. Sometimes it came in full sun, when sound should have carried plainly, and yet seemed to originate from nowhere. It never approached directly. It circled, withdrew, returned. When we tried to fix its direction by turning our heads, it shifted, as if it knew our attempts and mocked them. We found more footprints, always single, never a trail. Once we found our supplies disturbed, a bag of salt opened and poured in a perfect circle around the fire pit, as if to mark a boundary. Henderson bent to examine it, and then straightened quickly, his face pale. "It is a sign," he said. "Not random." Tomas's bravado cracked in small ways. He began to mutter prayers he claimed not to know. He checked his machete, and then checked it again. He refused to walk last in line. Don Rafael maintained an exterior of command, but I saw him touch the rosary Eusebio had left behind, which we had found hanging on a branch near the lagoon, as if placed there for us. As for me, I continued to write times and distances, but my handwriting grew smaller, tighter, as if I could compress fear into ink. I began to note the temperature at odd hours, because the air would sometimes chill without reason, raising gooseflesh on my arms even under the heat. I told myself it was evaporation from nearby water, yet the chill came even on dry ground. On the 25th day, Henderson woke me before dawn. His face was slick with sweat, though the air was cool. "Listen," he whispered. At first, I heard only the usual night sounds. Then, beneath them, a low rustling, not of wind, but of something moving through grass with weight. It circled the camp at a distance we could not judge. The mules shifted and snorted softly, their ropes taut. Then came the whistling, closer than it had ever been, and with it, a smell that made my stomach tighten, a dry, dusty odor like old bones kept in a sack, mixed with the sweet rot of swamp. Tomas sat up, eyes wide. Don Rafael reached for his carbine slowly, as if sudden motion would invite attention. Henderson's hands trembled around his notebook, absurd in that moment. The whistling rose to a higher note, and the rustling stopped. In the silence, something tapped the side of my boot, light like a finger. I looked down. At the edge of the firelight lay a small bone fragment, white as chalk, placed neatly against my leather. I did not pick it up. I could not. My throat closed. I stared until the firelight flickered and made it seem to move. Don Rafael whispered, "Do not touch it." We sat through the remainder of the night without sleep, the fire fed high, our eyes fixed on the grass beyond its reach. Nothing entered the circle of light, yet the sense of being observed pressed upon my skin as tangibly as humidity. By then, survival had begun to replace curiosity. Don Rafael decided we would turn back toward known water and settlements, even if it meant our work unfinished. He did not frame it as fear. He framed it as prudence, as a calculation of supplies and risk. Yet when he spoke, his voice carried the flatness of a man who had accepted that the plane did not obey his charts. We began our return on the 26th day, taking a route that should have brought us back to the Maurice stand within a week. The weather turned against us. Heat built, then broke into sudden storms that flooded low ground and forced us onto higher ridges where the grass was thinner and the horizon even more exposed. The whistling followed, sometimes faint, sometimes clear. When it fell silent, the absence felt like a hand removed from the throat just before it tightens again. On the third day of our retreat, Tomas lagged behind despite his earlier insistence on walking near the front. His face was drawn, his eyes red-rimmed. He spoke little. Once, when Henderson offered him water, Tomas stared at the cup as if unsure it was real. "You are sick," Henderson said. Tomas shook his head. "Not sick, marked." "What do you mean?" I asked, though part of me did not wish to know. Tomas swallowed. "In my sleep, I heard my father's voice," he said. "He has been dead 10 years. He called me by the name only he used. He told me to come." Henderson's expression tightened. "Dreams," he said too quickly. Tomas looked at him with a kind of pity. "If it was only a dream, why did it whistle after?" We did not answer. The whistling grew bolder as we fled. It began to come from directly ahead, forcing us to choose between walking toward it or detouring into worse ground. Don Rafael tried to hold to compass bearing, but twice we found ourselves returned to the same lone algarobo with the spiral scratches, as if the plane had folded and laid itself over our path. Henderson remarked on it with a strained calm, and I saw him begin to doubt not only the world, but his own senses. On the 31st day, near dusk, we reached a stretch of dry ground, dotted with low shrubs. We decided to camp there, exhausted, our clothes stiff with dried mud. Don Rafael set watches, though the idea of sleeping while something moved unseen around us seemed foolish. Still, the body demands rest. I took the second watch. The moon was a thin curve and the stars were sharp. The plain lay open, and yet the darkness between shrubs felt dense, as if it held weight. The fire had burned down to coals. The mules dozed fitfully. At some hour past midnight, the temperature dropped so suddenly that my breath showed faintly. I rubbed my arms, startled. In that chill, the whistling began, very near, and for the first time the tune altered. It added a note that did not belong, a discord that made the hair at the nape of my neck rise. The mules jerked awake. One screamed, a sound I had not known a mule could make, and threw itself against its rope until the fibers snapped. It ran into the dark and vanished, its hoofbeats swallowed by grass. Don Rafael sprang up, carbine raised. Henderson stumbled from his hammock, blinking. Tomas stood already awake, machete in hand, his face set in terror that had moved beyond expression. The whistling moved around us, not circling wide now, but passing close, as if someone walked just beyond the firelight. The shrubs trembled, though there was no wind. I smelled again that dry bone dust odor, stronger now, and beneath it something like old sweat. Then I saw it, not fully, not as one sees a man in daylight, but enough to lodge in my mind forever. Between two shrubs, at the edge of the coal's glow, a figure stood with its back half-turned. It was tall and thin, the outline wrong in its proportions, as if stretched. Over one shoulder hung a sack, and the sack sagged with weight that shifted slightly, making a faint clatter like teeth tapped together. The figure did not step forward. It did not need to. The whistling came from it, and yet its mouth did not move as a man's mouth must. The tune seemed to emanate from its chest, from the hollow of ribs. Henderson whispered, "Dear God," and that small sound was enough. The figure's head turned toward us with a slow deliberation. In the dim light, I caught a pale gleam where eyes should have been, not reflective like an animal's, but dull, like wet stone. The sack shifted again, and I heard distinctly the knock of bone on bone. Tomas made a choking sound and took one step forward, as if drawn. Don Rafael seized his arm. "Do not," Don Rafael said, his voice breaking for the first time. The whistling stopped. In the silence, the figure raised one hand, long-fingered, the joints too pronounced, and pointed, not at Tomas, not at Don Rafael, but at the ground beside our fire where the coals glowed red. Then, without any motion of departure that my mind could follow, it was gone. The shrubs stilled. The air warmed slightly, as if the chill had been carried away. We stood frozen, listening for retreating steps. There were none. Only the distant, ordinary sounds of night, returning cautiously, as if testing whether it was safe. Don Rafael spoke first, his voice hoarse. "We leave now." We did not argue. We did not pack with care. We seized what we could: the compass, the barometer, the ledger, a bag of dried meat. Henderson snatched his notebook as if it were a life. We abandoned the tent poles, the heavier crates, and one instrument case that had become, in our minds, a cursed object. The fire we kicked apart, scattering coals into the grass, not from any rational strategy, but from a primitive desire to erase our presence. We moved into the dark with only a lantern shuttered to a narrow slit, guided by compass and the faint light of stars. The plain at night is treacherous. One can step into water without warning. Yet fear drove us with a steadiness that daylight labor never produced. Our boots sank, pulled free, sank again. Mud took at our ankles. We did not stop to curse. Behind us, after perhaps an hour, the whistling began again, faint, distant, almost gentle. That was the worst of it. It did not pursue with haste. It did not need to. It simply reminded us that distance meant nothing. At dawn, we reached a shallow rise, where the grass was shorter and the ground firmer. We collapsed there, panting, our mouths tasting of iron. Henderson's hands shook so violently he could not open his water flask. I poured for him, and some part of me observed absurdly how the water splashed like quicksilver in the early light. Tomas sat with his head in his hands. Don Rafael stared out over the plain, his face grey. "We saw a man," I said, clinging to the last splinter of rationality. "A bandit, a lunatic with a sack." Don Rafael did not look at me. "A man does not leave no tracks," he said. "A man does not chill the air." Henderson spoke without lifting his eyes. "A man does not make a mule scream." We resumed walking as soon as our legs would bear it. The return journey became a blur of heat, thirst, and constant listening. Twice we thought we saw movement in the grass, a tall silhouette that vanished when we turned our heads. Once we found a line of bone fragments laid across our path like a warning. We stepped around them without speaking. Tomas worsened. On the second night after the encounter, he woke screaming, insisting someone stood over him counting. Counting what, he could not say. He began to lag again, and Don Rafael had to order him forward like a soldier under fire. Henderson tried to speak to him of home, of horses, of the river port, but Tomas's eyes had the distant look of a man already half gone. On the fourth day, we reached a caño we recognized by its bend and the cluster of palms near it. Relief should have come then. Instead, unease deepened, because recognition meant we had truly been turned around before, guided back to markers as if by design. That evening, as we boiled water, a flock of birds rose suddenly from the reeds, not in their usual gradual stirring, but in a panicked burst, wings beating hard. They fled west in a tight mass. A moment later, the whistling sounded from the reeds they had abandoned, soft and patient. We did not camp there. We moved on until our legs failed. When at last we reached the Maurice stand where we had shared Henderson's tobacco weeks before, it felt like returning to a place from a dream. The palms stood as they had, indifferent. Yet the air seemed altered, as if the plain itself had been marked by our passage. We found, hanging from a palm frond, Eusebio's rosary again, though we had taken it with us. The beads swung gently, though there was no wind. Don Rafael took it down with careful fingers and placed it in his pocket without a word. We reached San Fernando de Apuro on the 4th of June, thinner, sunburned, and with eyes that startled the men at the dock. The town smelled of smoke and horses and cooking fat, ordinary scents that should have anchored us. Yet even there, when a boy whistled to call a dog, Tomas flinched so hard he spilled his water. The captain of the small river steamer that had agreed to carry us north took one look at us and demanded an explanation. Don Rafael gave him a version that could be spoken aloud. Lost mule, storms, illness, hostile terrain. He did not mention bone fragments in a sextant case. He did not mention a sack that clattered. The captain listened, skeptical, and then shrugged in the manner of men who have seen enough of the world to dismiss what they cannot afford to believe. In the days that followed, we were required to file our report with the local authority before it could be sent onward by post. Don Rafael and I sat at a table in a hot room, ink sweating in its bottle, and tried to translate the Llanos into acceptable language. Henderson sat nearby, silent, his notebook closed. "What do we write?" I asked Don Rafael at last, my pen hovering. "We write what can be measured," he said. "We omit what cannot. And if what cannot be measured is the only thing that mattered." He looked at me then, and his eyes were older than when we had left. "If we write it," he said, "they will laugh, and we will lose our work, our names, and perhaps our liberty." So we wrote of weather and watercourses. We wrote of delays and the loss of a mule. We wrote of the guide's desertion and of our decision to return for reasons of supply. We did not write of the whistling that moved like intelligence through grass. We did not write of the cold breath from a latched case. We did not write of the figure at the edge of coals. Henderson offered one sentence, spoken quietly as if to himself. Unaccountable disturbances of animal behavior. Don Rafael nodded and allowed that phrase into the report, a small crack through which truth might one day seep. When the report was read by an official in a clean shirt who smelled of soap, he frowned at unaccountable disturbances and asked if we had been drinking. Tomás, standing behind us, clenched his jaw until I thought his teeth would break. "We were in the field," Don Rafael said stiffly. "We observed what we observed." The official waved his hand. "The Llanos are full of tales," he said. "Men frighten themselves. There are jaguars, there are thieves, there is fever, that is all." We left his office with our papers stamped and our mouths full of bitterness. Outside, the town went on with its ordinary noise. Somewhere, a man whistled a tune to amuse himself, and my stomach tightened before I could stop it. In private, in the small room we shared above a stable, Henderson opened his notebook at last. He showed me sketches, the splayed footprint, the spiraled scratches, the bone fragments laid in arc. His hand had been steady when he drew, as if drawing were his last defense against madness. "Do you believe in it?" I asked him, meaning the folklore, the whistler, the sack of bones. Henderson closed the notebook carefully. "I believe," he said, choosing each word, "that something intelligent wished us to know it was present. I do not know what name it bears. Tomás left us soon after, taking work with cattle far from the region. Before he went, he pressed something into my hand, one of the bone fragments wrapped in cloth. I took it without knowing," he said, his voice flat. "It was in my pack. It wants to travel." I tried to refuse, but his eyes held a plea that was also a command. "Bury it," he said, "or throw it in a river. Do not keep it near your bed." I did as he asked. I walked to the river at dusk and cast the wrapped fragment into the brown water. It sank without a splash, swallowed as if it had never been. Years passed. I returned to Caracas. I married. I took a post that kept me among papers and ink, far from open horizons. For a time, I told myself the Llanos had been an episode of exhaustion and suggestion, a convergence of superstition and hardship. Yet the body remembers what the mind tries to smooth away. The first haunting came in a place that should have been safe, my own courtyard, on a cool evening when rain threatened. A neighbor's boy stood outside the gate, whistling idly as boys do. The tune was not the same as that on the plain, yet something in the steadiness of it made my skin tighten. The air seemed to cool by a degree. I smelled, impossibly, that dry dust of old bone. I dropped the cup I was holding. It shattered on the stones. My wife came running, alarmed. I could not explain why my hands shook. I told her only that the sound had startled me. I did not say that for a moment I had seen, in the corner of my eye, a tall, thin shadow where no man stood. The second scene came 2 years later, when I travelled by post road through low country and had to spend a night at an inn near Calabozo. The air there had the same wide openness, the same grass smell carried on wind. In the night, as I lay in a narrow bed, I heard whistling outside, faint and measured. I sat up, heart hammering, and listened. The tune rose and fell with the patience of breath that does not tire. I rose, went to the window and looked out. The yard was empty. The horses in the stable shifted and snorted. The innkeeper's dog whined softly, tail tucked. I did not sleep again until dawn. I wrote to Henderson once in 1895, asking if he had found any explanation in his studies. His reply came months later, the paper smelling of sea travel. He wrote that he had returned to England, that he had presented his notes to a small circle of naturalists who smiled politely and spoke of hysteria and tropical fever. He wrote that he had tried to locate accounts of El Silbón in printed collections and found variations, but always the same core. The whistle that deceives distance, the sack of bones, the punishment that follows certain sins. I do not know whose bones, he wrote. Perhaps the tale is immoral. Perhaps it is older than morality. I confess that when the wind moves through bare trees here, I sometimes hear a note that is too steady to be wind. After that, his letters ceased. I learned later, through a mutual acquaintance, that he had died of illness in 1898. The news struck me with a grief sharper than I expected, as if a witness had been removed and the burden of memory shifted heavier onto my shoulders. Don Rafael, I saw once more in 1903 at a government office. He had advanced in rank, his hair gone grey. We spoke formally at first of work and family, as men do when they wish to avoid deeper subjects. Then, as we stood by a window overlooking a street where carts creaked and vendors called, a man below whistled to his mule. Don Rafael's hand went to his pocket. His fingers closed around something unseen. He looked at me. "Do you still hear it?" he asked very softly. "Sometimes," I admitted. He nodded once, as if that confirmed a private fear. "I kept the rosary," he said. "Not because I believe it wards anything, only because it reminds me that another man knew when to turn back." We did not speak of the figure by the fire. We did not need to. The silence between us held it, shaped like a shadow. I attempted once, in 1906, to rationalize the matter with the tools of my education. I sought out a physician who had studied nervous disorders and spoke of suggestion and trauma. I described, in careful terms, the whistling and the cold, omitting the sack. He listened, steepling his fingers, and then spoke of auditory hallucinations brought on by exhaustion, of the mind patterning random sounds into meaning. His words were learned. They should have soothed me. Yet as I left his office, I realized he had addressed only what happened inside my skull. He had not explained the coiled rope. He had not explained the bone fragments arranged in velvet. He had not explained 4 men hearing the same tune in the same moment. What troubled me most over the years was not fear alone, but the sense of being considered. Predators hunt, storms strike, fever takes. Those are blind forces. What we encountered felt like a tension, like a will that chose when to reveal itself and when to withdraw. In quiet moments when my household slept and the city noises softened, I would recall the way the air cooled around our camp as if something had stepped near. I would recall the mule sinking to its knees, refusing to rise, as if its animal sense had recognized what my reason denied. I would recall the figure's hand pointing to our fire, not threatening, not pleading, merely indicating as if to say, "Here is your small light, here is how little it means." I came to accept, reluctantly, that there are regions of experience that do not submit to the instruments we prize. The sextant measures stars, not intentions. The compass points north, not away from what watches. If I had understood Eusebio's warning at the beginning, would I have turned back then, spared Tomas his nights of counting, spared Henderson his lonely notes? Or would turning back have been merely another path the plains allowed us to take, another story folded into grass? I asked myself such questions only a few times, for they led nowhere and left the taste of that cold air in my mouth. Now, as an older man, I do not claim to know whether El Silbón is a spirit, a tale given teeth by fear, or something older than either. I know only what my senses recorded, and what my ink could not carry into official pages. I know that the Llanos, vast and seemingly empty, can hold a presence that announces itself not by roar, but by a patient tune. In the end, the detail that returns most often is not the sight of the sack, nor the pale gleam of eyes, but the moment of silence after the whistling ceased, when the night held its breath, and even the insects waited, and I understood that we were not alone in the dark. Even now, when a steady whistle threads through an open window on a cool night, my skin tightens as it did on that plain, and I find myself listening for the sound of bones settling in a sack.